Hello and welcome to Story Radio, the podcast for readers, writers and lovers of short stories everywhere.
Today, Miki Lentin and Goran Ali have come to talk to us at Story Radio. Miki Lentin is the author of Inner Core, which is published by Goran's publishing house, Afsana Press. Welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here.
Yeah. Okay, Miki. I've really enjoyed your collection Inner Core, and I've touched on some interesting themes. I like the portrait of Ireland and Dublin in particular, and the aspects of Judaism. I wondered if you could just talk a little bit more about the genesis of the collection and the themes you are exploring.
Thank you. Thank you for the praise as well, Martin. That's really great to hear. So the book itself is split into three sections really, and what I was trying to do was provide, I suppose, a sort of overview of my life of the past sort of few years in a way. So thematically, there's a few different things going on. I think I'm covering some issues of mental health and sort of middle-aged angst and issues of masculinity that I have experienced over the past few years. So they are sort of more memoir pieces written in the first person. Some of them I've written through an alter ego that I've developed, who's an Irish man called Jerry, and Jerry lives with his wife called Mel. So some of the stories are positioned around their family life and their life. Some of them are more positioned around my current life, living in London. Some of the other pieces then, in the second part, sort of move towards the theme of what I feel is a question around what it means to do good in society, and that's mostly around work that I've done with refugees, and that's why I decided to donate the proceeds of this book to a refugee charity called Food Kind. But the question that I was really interested there is, why are we doing these good things? Why are we volunteering to help people? What does that mean for us? What does that mean for me as a middle-aged man? How do I feel about it? Are we just doing it for our own benefit, or are we doing it for sort of more broader benefit, I suppose? And the third section is kind of things that I've been thinking about. So it's more memories of my childhood, growing up in Dublin, in Ireland, and just sort of things that have sort of been memories that have been bubbling up inside me, I suppose, over the past few years that I wanted to explore in a bit more detail. So thematically, it's a bit of a mix of things, but it covers kind of things that I've been thinking about over the past few years, really.
Is it a Dublin that's disappeared now? Is it a very different place from the Dublin you write about?
I still really like Dublin, and I think there's an essence of Dublin that will always be there. It's like an onion to me in a way. Sort of you peel off layer after layer, and I consistently find things about Dublin that I like still. I travel there quite a lot to see family, but I really enjoy the fact that it had such a strong impact on my life. And still does. The experiences that I had in growing up, one of the stories, which is called Varifocals, is about my time working in a restaurant in Dublin when I left school. And that was a brilliant time of my life at the age of 16, 17, working with older people, experiencing going out late at night, lots of drinking, lots of relationships, lots of smoking, lots of, sort of being quite a mature sort of young person at that time. So I think there's elements that, to me, are still very much alive within me, and that I want to sort of capture still. And I think when you get to my age now, sort of in my late 40s, I think you begin to think more about things that happened to you when you were sort of in your late teens, and those are experiences that I think can affect you greatly. And I think many writers come back to those things. I know Roddy Doyle does, for example, in some of his work, and he inspires me a lot. So I'm very interested in those ideas, actually.
How did your ideas about why people do good and help develop through the writing of the collection? Did you find yourself in a different position at the end than when you started?
I think it's just a really interesting question. So our family housed an Iranian refugee a few years ago, and he lived with us for 18 months, and then we housed an asylum seeker. And I was always very interested in the reaction that people had to this stranger who was in our house. So when we told people that he was living with us, then it was interesting to see what people's body language had that shifted. It was interesting to see their facial expressions, I suppose. And when we were out with Reza, his name, when we introduced him to people, then people would react in different ways, and I was they were kind of. Some people kind of asked, well, why are you doing this? And sometimes that was quite a difficult thing to answer. Why were we doing this? Was there an element of showing off there to a certain extent? I don't think so. But was there also an element of, we want to do something good? Yes, I do think that. So I think it's possibly a bit of both. And I think that that's a huge question in our modern society of how we deal with these questions, I think.
Yeah, I think it's been interesting how things have changed with people's response to Ukrainian refugees, where people seem so much more positively inclined. I think that's been quite interesting.
Well, I have my own opinions on that. Those opinions might not necessarily be popular. I know Tabitha has a Ukrainian refugee living in her house, which is brilliant. But I do think there is a question of race there massively, and I do believe that actually it's great all the support that the Ukrainians are getting. I'm fully supportive of it. However, it would have been nice for as many people to have shown support to refugees from Afghanistan and Syria and lots of other places in the past as well. But, we are where we are, I suppose. Yeah.
Your story, Meringues, is very good on, I guess, skewering some of the sort of discomfort and feelings of futility, perhaps, or kind of how it's handled at the social level, this kind of situation, and how people adjust, I guess, to the.
I think that is an interesting story. So the scene of that story is a sort of a Christmas party that I take the refugees living with us too, and that was a real life experience, and it was very, very awkward, basically, in my opinion, and people trying to also to a certain extent show off to the refugees by everybody buying kind of Middle Eastern food for them, for example, and all eating that together and listening to a certain kind of music. And sometimes I kind of felt that it was very, very try-hard, actually. And actually, Reza, who was living with us, he wanted to live a normal life like the rest of us. He wanted Western clothes, he wanted to eat Western food, he wanted to do Western things, I suppose. He didn't want to be pitied, or for people to feel like they had to give him charity in a way. And so there was this awkward conflict, I think, between what we as Westerners feel that these people want and what they actually want from us, if anything at all. And they are all very grateful. It's just so I found that whole situation that you find yourself in kind of quite awkward, actually, and I was interested to explore that through that story. Yeah.
That's one of our stories that we recorded as well.
Grant, do you want to talk a little bit about the collection at all?
About Miki's book. Actually, it's very interesting because this was Afsana Press's second book, but there are some nearness, if you could say that, to my own book, which was the first book, like the theme of refugees. So it is. I found that very interesting that. Somehow it became like a theme for the two first books of Afsana Press. What I like about Miki's short stories is the use of language, like in a very economical way, and it's like there are a lot of details. He gives details of movements or sometimes the feeling of a character, but it's not descriptive. It's very economical and minimalistic, actually, in some way. And I love that. I love that in the stories. While they are loaded with really lots of questions, like it's also called the inner core. But honestly, most of the stories, it's all about like an inner struggle. Most of the characters are man. So usually it's like the inner struggle of a man in the world now, and dealing with all the issues around us, and that makes it also very up to date. It's really, they are all about now. It's simple, but it is very expressive, and I don't know. So that
the actual kind of dealing with family life is kind of quite unusual in fiction. Well, particularly from male fiction, and I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, they were very honest.
Yeah.
Exactly, very honest.
Yeah, I think a lot of male fiction was quite dominated by that model of the Joseph O'Connor hero's journey and so on, which doesn't really have a place for family life, and I think women's fiction tended not to follow that model, and I think it's kind of interesting to see what develops when you step away from that and think about things differently.
I think so, yeah, and also I'm also interested in exploring the mental health struggles that are quite well known amongst middle-aged men as well. There's a very, very big high suicide rate amongst middle-aged men, for example, and I myself in one of my stories explore those difficulties that I have as well, and I think I wanted to see what that felt like in writing and how I was able to communicate, or perhaps not communicate, that with my wife as well, and what that was like. And I do feel that that's I think I'm intrigued by the idea of kind of family life, especially in middle age, because I think for me that dynamic of living with somebody is different to the dynamic of having a partner when you're younger. Obviously you have children, so there's different struggles in your life. There's financial struggles. There aren't in my relationship with my wife, but there might be marital problems. There are children as well involved. So I think, and I mentioned Roddy Doyle earlier on, and I think he's an interesting person to think about, because in his recent collection, which is called Life Without Children, if I'm not mistaken, he explores this a lot, and I'm really inspired by him, because he writes about sort of the complexity of family life, especially once kids start to grow up, and actually how men in particular, because he writes really about middle-aged men, find themselves kind of on a precipice of not really knowing where they stand anymore, after having been around younger children and having lots to do, and then perhaps being in an office job or something along those lines and doing the same thing, and all of a sudden they find themselves in a situation where the children may have left home and they may need to get a different kind of job, and things have changed and they're automatically kind of left slightly stranded. And I'm very interested by that, and how does that relationship, how do they deal then with their partner or their wife? How do they deal with their children who might be grown up? How do they deal with their friends, for example, and the rest of their family? And what does that kind of vacancy feel like, that sort of emptiness feel like? So I am intrigued by kind of modern middle-aged family. I think it's an interesting topic to explore.
Your story very focused, was very good on the sort of I guess emptiness dynamic, for want of a better way to put it. It's a really brilliant sort of sketch of couples attempting to communicate while at the same time have they said everything they have to say.
Well, I think that's the thing. Sometimes, like in relationships, I suppose it's okay to not say anything. Silence is a good thing, actually. Sometimes.
Could you tell us a little bit more about Jerry and Mel, and because they feature in a few of the stories, don't they?
Yeah. So Jerry and Mel are, as I said, Jerry is, I suppose, my alter ego to a certain extent. So he goes through experiences that I have perhaps been on myself, and he's struggling with certain things in his life, struggling with home life dynamic, I suppose, to a certain extent, struggling with his relationship with his children who may have grown up, struggling with his work. And he's a bit of a lonely character as well. And I think Jerry and Mel are both kind of quite independent people as well, who like to kind of do their own things. And maybe that independence has kind of stretched the gap between them to a certain extent. And and as I say, this is not what my marriage is like at all. But in Very Focals, for example, one of the stories, I'm always really interested in this idea of like, what do couples say to each other when they go out for dinner, for example? And that whole premise came from me and my family being on holiday in Greece and literally looking at this couple for hours, just not saying anything to each other. And you would just think to yourself, my God, there's something in that. How long have they lived together? Has just conversation completely dried out? And then what do they say to each other after they finish their meal? What happens when they go home? Does that silence still exist? Do they both do their own things? And I'm interested in silence, I suppose. I'm interested in the dynamic of silence, the awkwardness of silence, the fact that in today's society it's quite difficult to be silent or to find that space to be silent. And what do people think about when things like? I mean, I don't always like silence, actually. I always like to have things on in the background. But some people are very comfortable with it. And I think if you're an anxious person, like I am sometimes, I don't like that sense of silence because I begin to worry. And I think Jerry is definitely someone who doesn't like silence because he doesn't quite know what to do with himself.
He struggles. It is in varifocals, isn't it? He struggles to. He wants to say something to Mel so badly, and in the end, he jumps up on a chair and tells the whole restaurant. And I thought that was lovely about the sort of frustration of really wanting to say something, but
because he doesn't know if she'll believe him or if she really wants to listen, but actually she desperately does. And at the end, she's kind of like, I'm here for you, but she hasn't really said that before, and not to blame her at all, but I think he desperately wants to tell her, and he wants to recount the memories, but because time has moved on and that gap, as I said, that has really stretched between them, he's not quite sure how to do it anymore. And that made that sort of frivolity and sort of, I suppose, sense of ease that you have at the beginning of a relationship with someone perhaps has dissipated slightly, and he doesn't quite know what to do. So I'm interested in those silences, actually.
Yeah, we were talking about sort of how that kind of family life doesn't really appear in a lot of male fiction.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. Well, not male fiction that I've read, I have to say. Maybe it does in some male fiction. But as I said before, I'm very intrigued by the writing of Roddy Doyle and his short stories, especially his two collections, Bullfighting and Life Without Children, where he really does explore, I think, in an absolutely superb way. And you talked about language earlier on, Goran, and he does it brilliantly, where his sense of language is kind of really pared down. It's really economical. So in a way, he uses very, very simplistic language. There's nothing flowery about his writing. There's nothing kind of ornamental about it. It's a simple type of language that we would all use all the time. And sometimes you read it and you go, it just seems too simple. But actually, it's so simple, it's kind of obvious and lovely to read, and therefore it's very readable. And I think therefore you can really get into his characters. This kind of simple male character, usually a male character, who just has impulses that are quite complicated, and I think come from a disrupted family life, perhaps, or doesn't quite know where they stand. There's a great story in Bullfighting, which I can't remember the name of now, where the man he gets a real urge to eat raw meat, and he just starts to eat this raw meat, and he starts to kill the chickens next door, and then his wife eventually joins in with him, and it's a lovely and quite horrific depiction of like, I just want to do something mad and crazy, and I've got a lust for blood. Not in a sort of horror kind of way, but I've got a lust to do something where I can dig my teeth into that's really visceral, and it is very visceral, and it's quite emotional actually. But sometimes I think we all have these kind of urges, and we don't quite know what to do with them. And I think Roddy Doyle explores these urges really uniquely, and I do think that comes from a sense of family life sometimes being complicated and being quite silent sometimes. So yeah,
in the efflorescence, your story is almost that urge to scratch the cars.
Yeah, and I kind of got the idea. I mean, that efflorescence is based on a walk, meeting a friend on a walk, and then what happens, and explores kind of these two characters who don't quite know what to do with each other, and then Jerry kind of wants to be a bit like Ross, who is the man who's just gone through a divorce. And not that Jerry wants to divorce his wife necessarily, but Ross seems to have a certain freedom to him which Jerry kind of yearns for. And he's smoking, for example, so Jerry has a cigarette and he's desperate for a cigarette even though he doesn't really smoke. Just the little things like that. But then when he's kind of asked, do you want to key some cars, at first he's like, what, why would I do that? But then the more he thinks about it, the more it kind of appeals to him, and he's got this urge, he doesn't quite know what to do with it. And then when he does it, he feels this tremendous lightness, this tremendous kind of sense of, I've done something naughty, but it really feels really good, and it's okay, and nothing bad is going to happen. And actually that little bit of lightness is quite relieving, perhaps. So yeah, I'm interested in that idea actually.
Yeah, I remember when you first have a child, you suddenly realise that your time is all accounted for. That you've never got, until that point, you could just wander off and do things, and no one really cares. And you can go and not be around, and no one knows where you are. And then suddenly you're kind of accountable, and everyone, people have to know where you are all the time. It's like a big change that you're not really prepared for.
Yeah, I agree with you.
It does come to an end eventually.
Well, in one of the stories, which is called The Rock, I kind of, it's kind of, I'm exploring this idea of like sort of wanting to take something from somewhere and what that means, and actually trying to understand what that rock meant for my child, and as a parent sometimes struggling to make that connection, that actually these things actually are very meaningful to children, and then eventually realising that actually it's really meaningful to me as well. But it took me a while to actually get to that position, because our children in a way are mirror images of that, but we don't always want to believe that, do we? And I was interested in that idea of the similarities between us as characters, and I know that my daughter is very similar to me in many ways. So I'm going to read the first paragraph of the first story, which is called Inner Core. I never admitted it to my wife M, but I really wanted the boy with a toothy grin to pull the trigger and shoot the French woman who was standing a few steps from us. I had nothing against her. I didn't want her to die. But at that moment, I wanted everything to pause, so I could hear the crack of a gun blast, smell the gunpowder, and see if I could follow the bullets spinning through the air. I even considered what it would be like to lick the spattered blood from my face, wipe M's jacket down, and go for dinner on the Asian side of Istanbul, just as we'd planned. There you go.
Great, thank you.
Thank you so much, Miki and Goran. It was lovely to speak to you both. And just for our listeners, Goran will come back in next month to talk about his novel Glass Wall.
Thank you for having us. It's been really good.
Thank you
Thank you very much.
Thank you.